The dust in that attic didn't just float. It conspired. I remember watching a single mote caught in the razor-thin beam of sunlight that managed to pierce the slate roof. It spun there, suspended in the suffocating August heat, indifferent to the fact that I was dissolving into a puddle of terror on the floorboards. It's funny what the mind latches onto when you are 21 years old and waiting to die. I tell people now that I was thinking about France, about the occupation, about the grand sweeping narrative of liberation. But that is the lie of an old man polishing his medals. In truth, I was thinking about the itch on my left ankle and how moving to scratch it might creak the floorboards loud enough to alert the landlady, or worse, the black car I imagined idling 3 streets over. They say memory is a library, but mine feels more like a burnt-out cinema. The reels are spliced together wrong. Sometimes I'm back in the courtyard of the university in Lyon, before the gray uniforms turned the city monochrome. I can smell the roasted chestnuts from the vendor near the gate, and I can hear the furious, beautiful noise of Philippe arguing about the social contract, his hands waving as if he were conducting a symphony of logic. We were students then. We believed that if you could construct a perfect argument, you could reshape the world. We thought the Germans were a philosophical error, a contradiction that could be solved with enough rigor. I tried to bring that discipline into the attic with me. I arranged my pencils like surgical instruments. I folded the silk map with the precision of an origami artist. I told myself that this was just another examination, that the Morse key was no different than a fountain pen, and the encoded groups were just Latin declensions waiting to be parsed. But the heat made a mockery of my academic order. It was a physical weight, pressing the air out of the room until the atmosphere felt solid, composed of dry rot and the metallic tang of fear. My hands were the traitors. I looked at them and didn't recognize the trembling fingers. These were the hands that had turned the delicate pages of Spinoza without tearing them. No, they were slick with sweat, hovering over the suitcase radio, the Mark III transceiver that looked less like a weapon of war and more like a darkly complex typewriter designed to compose obituaries. I had to set it up. The silence of the house was absolute, a heavy blanket that made my own pulse sound like a drum in a cathedral. I reached for the latch of the suitcase. The sound of the metal clasp springing open was not a click. It was a gunshot in a canyon. I froze, my lungs seizing, waiting for the shout from below, the heavy boots on the stairs. Nothing, just the settling of the house, the groan of timber expanding in the heat. I began to assemble the station. It was a ritual, a liturgy of wires and valves. I connected the antenna wire I had strung along the rafters the night before, disguised amidst the cobwebs. The smell of the equipment hit me then, ozone, hot lacquer, and cold steel. It was the scent of the modern world invading the ancient dust of Lyon. I looked at the message pad. It was blank. I didn't need to write the ciphers down. That was my trick, my curse. The network called it a gift. I called it a burden. I closed my eyes and the grid appeared in the darkness behind my eyelids, glowing like neon. I could see the coastal defenses of Dieppe, the artillery placements we had observed, translated into 5-letter groups. Intelligence said the raid was imminent. Operation Jubilee, a grand name for sending boys to die on a rocky beach. My job was to tell London where the guns were so fewer mothers would receive telegrams. But to tell them, I had to speak, and to speak was to die. Every radio operator knows the math. It is a calculus of seconds. You are safe for 3 minutes, maybe 5, if the German direction-finding teams are lazy or eating their lunch. After 5 minutes, the triangulation lines on their maps intersect. After 10, they are on your street. After 15, they are kicking down the door. I looked at my watch. The second hand swept around with agonizing slowness. I wiped my palm on my trousers, leaving a dark streak on the fabric. The fear wasn't about pain. Not really. I couldn't imagine pain. The fear was about the breaking. I was a student. I was made of ideas and soft skin. I knew that if they took me to the cellars of the Hotel Terminus, I would not be like the heroes in the novels. I would talk. I would spill the codes, the names, the safe houses. I would trade Philippe's life for a glass of water. That was the monster in the room with me, not the Gestapo, but my own potential cowardice. The time had come. The schedule was absolute. London was listening. I reached out and clamped the heavy Bakelite headphones over my ears. The world of the attic, the dust, the heat, the itch on my ankle vanished instantly, replaced by the oceanic roar of the ether. It was a chaotic sea of static, a rushing wind of white noise that sounded like the universe breathing. My right hand, trembling no longer, settled on the key. I took a breath that tasted of copper. I pressed down. The contact closed. The spark leaped. I sent the call sign, 3 sharp dots, 2 dashes. I had just raised a flag in the dark. I had just screamed my name in a crowded room of assassins. The static hissed back at me, indifferent. Then the change happened. It always did. The moment the rhythm took me, Jean-Luc the student evaporated. There was no more philosophy, no more debate. There was only the signal. I didn't need the code sheet. The numbers and letters scrolled through my mind's eye with the clarity of a printed page. My fingers danced on the key, light and fast. I had a fist, a distinctive style of tapping that the boys in London would recognize. To them, I wasn't a scared kid in an attic. I was a reliable cadence, a distinct musical signature in the cacophony of the war. I waited. The silence between the static crashes stretched. Had they heard, was the atmospheric skip favorable? Or was I shouting into the void while the vans prowled the streets below? And then out of the hiss it came. A sharp, chirping tone, clear as a bell. The acknowledgement. The threshold was crossed. The umbilical cord of radio waves now connected this dusty attic in Lyon to a bunker in England. The distance collapsed. I was no longer in occupied France. I was in the aether, a ghost floating between worlds. But the acknowledgement brought a cold realization. The clock had started. The hunters were turning their dials. The game had begun. I began the transmission in earnest. I poured the data into the key. I visualized the German gunners at their posts in Dieppe, unaware that a student 100 miles away was drawing a target on their foreheads. My internal mentor, that strange, detached part of my brain that stored the codes, took over. It whispered the sequences to my fingers, bypassing my conscious thought. This was necessary. If I stopped to think, to verify, I would slow down. And speed was life. I remembered Henry. He was the operator before me. He had been a musician, a pianist. He had beautiful hands. They sent his hands back to his mother in a shoebox after they caught him. The image flashed in my mind, not the gore but the silence of it, the absence of music. I pushed the thought away, shoving it into the dark corners of the room. Focus. The sweat ran into my eyes, stinging like acid. The attic was an oven, but I was shivering. The sensory world had narrowed down to the pressure of the key against my fingertip and the sounds in my ears. The headphones were a chaotic symphony. I heard the crackle of thunderstorms over the Alps, the ghostly bleed of a Spanish broadcast playing flamenco music, and the rhythmic tapping of other clandestine stations. Other frightened souls tapping out their existence in the dark. We were a choir of ghosts, but I was listening for something else. Underneath the static, underneath the music and the storms, I was listening for the enemy. The German were professionals. They didn't just listen. They hunted. I imagined them in their trucks, wearing headphones just like mine, turning the large metal loops on the roofs of their vehicles. They were triangulation artists, drawing lines on a map of Lyon. Every letter I sent was a pencil stroke on their paper. Where they crossed, there was the attic. There was me. I was halfway through the message. The artillery battery coordinates were long, complex strings of numbers. My wrist began to ache, a dull throb that worked its way up my forearm. I couldn't stop. To stop was to break the connection. To stop was to let the boys at Dieppe walk into fire without a map. The static surged, a wave of noise crashing against my eardrums. I adjusted the tuning dial with my left hand, milometer by milometer, chasing the frequency. The signal drifted. The equipment was overheating. I could smell the hot varnish of the coils. The radio was alive, struggling in the heat just as I was. "Come on," I whispered, my voice sounding foreign in the empty room. "Stay with me." I hit the end of the second block. I paused, waiting for the confirmation. It came quickly. A small victory. A fatal victory. It meant I had to keep transmitting. I checked my watch again. 4 minutes. I was pushing my luck. The logic of the student screamed at me to sign off, to run, to bury the radio and flee across the rooftops. The logic of the soldier, the role I was playing so poorly, forced my hand back to the key. I started the final block. The most critical data. The timing of the patrols. The noise in the headphones shifted. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't the Spanish guitar. It was a new sound. A low, rhythmic thrumming. Like a heartbeat but mechanical. My stomach dropped. I knew that sound. It wasn't coming from the street. It was coming from the airwaves. It grew louder, sweeping across the frequency band. It was a scythe cutting through the tall grass, looking for the snake, jamming. They weren't just listening anymore. They had found the frequency. They were flooding it with noise to drown me out. And if they were jamming me, it meant they were close enough to get a strong signal. It meant the triangulation lines had already crossed. The sweeping pulse got louder, tearing through my Morse code, obliterating the clear tone of my transmission. I hammered the key harder, as if physical force could punch the signal through the electronic wall they were building around me. They were here. I ripped the headphones from my ears, and the silence of the attic rushed in to replace the static. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that precedes a thunderclap. I scrambled across the floorboards on my hands and knees, ignoring the splinters that bit into my palms, and pressed my face against the rough brickwork of the dormer window. I peeled back the edge of the blackout curtain by a fraction of an inch. There it was. The gray van was idling at the curb, its engine purring with a low, malevolent vibration that I could feel in the floor. Mounted on its roof was the loop antenna, a large metal halo that rotated with agonizing slowness. It was searching, sniffing the electromagnetic spectrum like a mechanical bloodhound. Then it stopped. The loop froze, pointing directly at my window. They had the scent. Below, the side door of the van slid open. 3 men spilled out onto the cobblestones. They did not look like the conscripts I saw manning the checkpoints. These men moved with the fluid, predatory grace of hunters. They wore long leather coats that swallowed the light, and even from 3 stories up, I could see the submachine guns slung across their chests. One of them pointed a gloved hand at the front door of my building. They didn't run. They walked with the terrifying assurance of men who know there is no escape. A heavy thud shook the building. Then another. They were not bothering to pick the lock. They were taking an axe to the front door. I looked back at the radio sitting on the crate. The amber light of the vacuum tubes was still glowing. A warm hearth in a cold world. The K was waiting. The message was incomplete. On my notepad, written in hasty pencil, lay the final sequence of coordinates, the safe channels through the German minefields off the coast of Dieppe. If I did not send them, the landing craft would be blindly steering into a slaughter. The logic of the mission was absolute. The message must be sent. But the logic of the resistance was colder. The network must survive. If I stayed to tap out those final 3 lines, they would be on me before I could destroy the codes. They would take me alive. And under the tools of the Gestapo, in the basement of the Hotel Terminus, I would eventually break. Everyone breaks. I would give them the frequencies, the safe houses, the names of the students and the bakers who had risked everything. The wood of the front door downstairs gave way with a sickening crack that echoed up the stairwell. Heavy boots hammered against the tile of the foyer. I had seconds. I made the choice that kills the soul to save the body. I abandoned the key. I snatched up the notepad. I did not try to memorize the numbers in the way a student memorizes a poem. I widened my eyes, staring at the graphite markings until they blurred and sharpened again. I forced my brain to become a camera shutter. I drank the image, searing the shape of the numbers into the visual cortex of my brain, locking them behind a mental door that I prayed would hold. Then I destroyed my world. I grabbed the heavy Luger pistol from the table. I reversed my grip, holding it by the barrel. With a grimace, I brought the steel butt down onto the radio's delicate internals. The glass vacuum tubes shattered. The glowing filaments snapped. The magic box that connected me to England was reduced to a heap of jagged glass and twisted wire. I pulled the pin on the thermite canister I kept next to the code books. I dropped it onto the stack of papers. A blinding white light, brighter than the sun, erupted in the dim attic. It hissed with a chemical fury, eating through the ciphers, eating through the frequency logs, burning through the table itself. The heat was instantaneous and searing, forcing me back against the wall. The boots were on the stairs now. Second floor. They were shouting commands, their voices harsh and distorted by the stairwell's acoustics. I dragged the wooden chair to the skylight. My hands were shaking, not with fear but with a surplus of adrenaline that made my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I pushed up on the iron latch. It was rusted shut. I slammed the heel of my hand against it, ignoring the pain, and shoved. The skylight groaned, a rusted screech of metal on metal, and swung open. The night air rushed in, cold and biting, smelling of river water and coal smoke. It was the smell of freedom, or perhaps just a different kind of trap. I hauled myself up, my elbows scraping raw against the frame. Below me, the attic door burst open. A beam of light cut through the smoke of the burning thermite, sweeping the room. "Halt!" a voice roared. I didn't look back. I kicked the chair away and rolled out onto the slates. The transition from the claustrophobic heat of the attic to the vast, open chill of the rooftop was a physical shock. I was no longer a radio operator, a man of intellect and precision. I was a hunted animal. The slate tiles were slick with the evening damp, treacherous as ice. My leather loafers, designed for the lecture halls of the university, struggled for purchase. I scrambled up the pitch of the roof, my fingers clawing at the soot-stained tiles. A burst of automatic fire erupted from the skylight behind me. Bullets chipped the brick chimney to my left, sending sharp fragments stinging into my cheek. They were not trying to capture me anymore. I crested the peak of the roof and slid down the other side, putting the solid mass of the building between me and the gunmen. I was running across the skyline of Lyon, a city that slept while a secret war raged on its tiles. I jumped to the neighboring roof, a gap of 3 feet that looked like a canyon in the moonlight. I landed hard, the impact jarring my teeth, my knees buckling under the force. I rolled, coming up in a crouch behind a row of terracotta chimney pots. I could hear them shouting from the window I had just fled. A searchlight beam from the street began to sweep the rooftops, a long, pale finger probing the darkness. I pressed myself into the soot and grime, making myself small, making myself part of the architecture. I was a student of philosophy who had learned that the only truth that mattered was survival. I moved only when the light swept past. I navigated the maze of zinc and slate, crossing from building to building, dropping onto balconies and climbing drain pipes with a desperation that silenced my fear of heights. I ran until my lungs burned like the thermite, until the shouts behind me faded into the ambient hum of the city. Hours later, I fell through the door of a cellar behind a bakery in the Croixhouse district. The air smelled of yeast and old flour. Elodie, the contact, was there, cleaning a rifle. She looked up, her face pale in the lantern light. I couldn't speak. My throat was parched, choked with the dust of the destruction I had wrought. I simply tapped my temple with a trembling finger. "Paper," I croaked. She handed me a pencil and a scrap of butcher's paper. I closed my eyes. I summoned the image from the dark room of my mind. The numbers were still there, glowing against the blackness. I wrote them down, my hands shaking uncontrollably, vomiting the intelligence onto the page before the trauma of the night could wipe the slate clean. I stared at the paper. I had saved the message, but I had lost the boy who used to sit in the university library, believing that words were tools for truth, not coordinates for artillery. That was a lifetime ago. I am an old man now. My hands, liver-spotted and frail, rest in my lap. They are the same hands that smashed the radio, but they feel like they belong to a stranger. History tells us that the Dieppe raid was a disaster, a bloody failure where thousands of young men were cut down on the pebble beaches. For years, I carried that failure like a stone in my gut. I thought my escape was an act of cowardice. I thought that by abandoning the radio, I had abandoned them. But truth is a complicated signal. Decades after the war, I met a man in a hospital in Montreal. He had lost his legs in 1942. He had been the coxswain of a landing craft approaching Blue Beach. He told me that just as they began their run-in, a message came through. A correction. They steered 3 degrees west. They missed the minefield that claimed the boats on either side of them. 30 men made it to the seawall because of those 3 degrees. 30 universes continued to exist. Children were born, houses were built, and lives were lived, all because a terrifyingly young man ran across the rooftops of Lyon with a sequence of numbers burning in his mind. Yet, the harvest is ruined. I never went back to the university. The machine of my youth, the belief in the civilized exchange of ideas, the sanctity of the intellect, was broken that night, smashed just as surely as I smashed those vacuum tubes. I cannot listen to the radio. The white noise between stations, that static hiss, brings the panic back instantly. It brings the smell of ozone and the sound of the axe splintering the door. I dream of running, always running under a pale moon, my feet slipping on wet slate, the abyss waiting on either side. I dream of the operators who didn't run, the ones who stayed at the key until the door burst open. I carry their silence with me. Victory is not always loud. It is not always a parade or a flag raised over a city square. Sometimes victory is quiet. It is the unsent message that saves the world. It is the secret kept in the dark. It is the refusal to let the signal die, even when the transmitter is destroyed. Remember the quiet rooms. Remember the silent battles fought in attics and cellars while the world slept. The fight for truth against those who would jam the signal is never truly over. You must keep listening. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.